We have a great guest with us today, one of my very favorite guests. His name is Dr. David Menton, and he was a professor for 34 years at the School of Medicine at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. And he's here today to talk to us about the whole birth process of a human child. And one of the phrases that comes to mind, we're going to read it from Scripture here in a few minutes, is fearfully and wonderfully made. That's how the psalmist describes our creation. Dr. Menton, what a joy to have you with us.
My pleasure, Don.
Now, today we're going to talk about babies. Everybody likes babies.
Yes, isn't that a cute baby we have
I'm telling you, that is a great
today
baby. There's a little
show.
that goes into the process before they get there, isn't
Okay.
it? Now, I guess we were talking just before we were on the air, and I was going to ask you, when does life begin? But you said that's not the right question. What's the right question?
No, I think if we were asked the wrong question, we're probably never going to get the right answer. And the reason when does life begin is the wrong question is that everything is alive. All life comes from previously existing life, so there is no beginning ever since creation. Even the uterus is alive. The egg cells are alive, the sperm cells are alive. Hey, our big toe is alive.
Yeah, I hope so.
So I think a better question is, when does a person begin in the womb? And I don't think that's a kind of question that science has an answer for. I think the only place we can go to get an answer to that question is to Scripture. And
so that's where you would like to start, with some Scripture. Is that right?
I think that's where we need to begin to address that interesting question. And we'll begin with that famous Psalm 139. For you, that is God, created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. We see that word knit so much in the Bible, that we were woven and knit, and I see that certainly when I look through the microscope at the human body. We are indeed knit and woven. It goes on to say, I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. In other words, it's pretty obvious that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. The psalm goes on to say, and this is a beautiful verse that I think has a lot to speak to us today. It says, my frame, my body, my bones, if you will, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. It's sort of a euphemism for the womb. When I was woven together, there it is again, in the depths of the earth, another euphemism for the womb. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. I think really the key here is that it says that God's eyes saw our unformed body. That means that as the body was forming in the womb, God was looking on.
Yes.
And, it's a kind of a terrible thought, but when a baby's aborted, I can just imagine somebody going in and just tearing that forming body out away from the very vision of God. Right before his eyes. And that's why I think this is such an important issue.
When it says that God saw the unformed body, he's not just a passive observer, is he?
No, that he certainly is not.
He's active.
He's active. He's forming. He hasn't just wound up a clock and let it run. When an egg is fertilized and that egg implants in the womb, that whole step from fertilization on, if we do not interfere, baby will shortly ensue.
Yes. Well, how does this begin?
Well, let's just go up and look at some of the events that happened as we develop from the very beginning. Okay, this is the uterus. It sits down low in the pelvis, and on either side of the uterus we have two structures, one over here, one over here. These are the ovaries. And it's in these ovaries that the eggs are produced. And you know, Don, when a baby girl is born, as soon as she comes out of the womb, she has all of the eggs in that ovary she's ever going to have in her whole life.
Well, you said the eggs are produced there. When are they produced?
Well, they're produced during the development of the baby in the womb, so that by the time the baby girl is born, they're all ready to go.
Wow.
And then when the girl reaches sexual maturity and begins to ovulate every 28 days, these ovaries are courteous. 1 month, this one ovulates, the next month this one, and they take turns back and forth. And if one of them becomes defective or removed, the remaining one has the great good sense to ovulate every month.
Wow.
Notice Next to the ovary is the oviduct. It's a tube on each side of the uterus. It runs up here, ends right here, and it has a kind of a funnel. Notice the funnel shape. And when the egg is ovulated, it's the job of that funnel to catch the egg like a catcher's mitt. If it were to miss, the egg would be out here in the peritoneum, and it could, in fact, if it were fertilized, implant there, and that would represent a medical emergency. Let's just follow the development of the egg in the ovary. As I mentioned, there's about 400,000 in here, and once the female reaches sexual maturity, each 28 days, about 40 or 50 of these eggs being stored, ready to go, will sort of begin to develop, will become larger. Cells will develop around the egg, and you get what we call a follicle. This is a follicle right here. It's kind of a big hollow ball, and the egg is right inside here. And the idea is the egg is going to be ovulated, that is, it'll be ejected right out through the wall of the follicle to be caught by that oviduct, the catcher's mitt, if you will. Now, as soon as that egg is ovulated, the remaining cells of the follicle that are left behind go on to form an endocrine organ that makes special hormones that will be necessary for the development of the baby. But if a signal is returned that says basically fertilization did not occur this time, then this endocrine organ that is built up from the remaining cells of the follicle will break down. And when it breaks down, it forms a large scar in the ovary about this big. So big that you can see it in an ovary without benefit of a microscope, just with the unaided eye. And each month another scar is formed, and within 4 or 5 months, the whole ovary would be nothing but scar tissue, and that would be the end of life right there. All ovaries, a solid mass of scar tissue. And you know the medical profession has never found a way to dissolve scars. Most of us have scars in our body that have been there for our life and will continue to be there. But you know the Lord has a miracle here. The one place in the body where a scar is completely dissolved. Boy, would plastic surgeons like to do that.
Yeah.
And here it is in the ovary. And if it were not so, this would be the end of the lecture right here, Don. We wouldn't go any further because the egg would never be getting out of the
I've got a feeling you and I wouldn't be here to talk about it.
That's right.
Yeah.
So let's move on. We've got a cutaway here of the ovary.
Amazing.
And the oviduct. The egg will go right in there, and the idea is it will be fertilized someplace right about here in the oviduct, and then it will continue to move down the oviduct into the uterus and will implant like a seed in the wall of the uterus. Now, to get that egg to move requires something just spectacular. We're going to look at that area enclosed by the box. These are the lining cells of the oviduct. They have little hairs on the surface. Of course, they're really not hairs, they're cilia. You can see them right here. I'll just sort of draw lines for them. They're all along here. And these cilia beat. Now, if they just beat like this, the egg couldn't move down the oviduct. If they beat like window wipers, like this, the egg would go back and forth. It wouldn't work. That'd be the end of life right there, Don. I mean, we couldn't go on with the lecture. But we know that the cilia beat in a way that is really extraordinary. It's called a metachronal rhythm. Let me show you what that rhythm looks like. This rhythm, and only this rhythm, it's the same thing you see when you see wind blow across a wheat field, or if you've seen them do the wave in the ball stadiums.
Yes.
This is it. Millions and trillions of these cilia down the oviduct must all beat in concert in a metachronal rhythm, or the egg doesn't go down the oviduct. If it would be fertilized but not go down the oviduct, you'd get a tubal pregnancy. That'd be the end of life right there. We wouldn't have to worry about anything beyond this. It would be over. But
so it's not just a miracle that God's put these cilia in there to move the egg, but the pattern with which they move is in and of itself miraculous.
It must be perfect.
Yes.
It must be integrated. Each cell would have hundreds, perhaps thousands of these cilia, and then millions and millions of cells, and all of the cilia working in concert along the entire oviduct to move the egg, without which, no life.
You know, I think of, you ever seen the pictures at the rock concerts where they pick someone up and they pass them down through the crowd? That's sort of what the cilia are doing with the egg. That's right.
And the egg is being passed down through the oviduct.
That's
Let's
right.
look at the timeline, Don. The egg is ovulated here at step 1. Fertilization typically occurs 12 to 24 hours. That's the window of opportunity for fertilization. It occurs right at the beginning of the oviduct. If fertilization occurs, then the egg moves down the duct, being moved by the cilia. At 30 hours here, 30 hours, we have the first division of that egg. It's really not an egg anymore. We call it a conceptus. And when that divides, we get a zygote, which is a little ball of cells. You can see it down here at 3 days. It's a little ball of cells that have divided. And at about 4 to 5 days, this ball of cells enters the uterus. This is after ovulation, and it's at this time that the ball of cells becomes hollow, we call it a blastocyst, and implants into the wall of the uterus like planting a seed in the soil, and the soil of the uterus is prepared just optimally to accept this at this time. Let's look at an egg actually moving down the oviduct. This is not fertilized yet. It's inside the oviduct, in this case a mouse. And around the egg, here's the egg here, is a large group of cells. These cells are called the cumulus cells. They accumulate around the egg. Were it not for these cells, it would be the end of life, Doug. The reason is the cilia cannot move the egg unless they contact these sticky cells here. If you strip the egg away from these cells, put it in the oviduct, it just sits here and spins.
Okay.
So we need to have the sticky cumulus cells. Here they are at a higher power, and inside the egg, this is the egg here, we see the chromosomes themselves, this little dot here, and those are the chromosomes that will be met by the chromosomes of the male sperm. If the two get together, from that moment on, the baby will develop. And here we get to a step that we will cover in the next part of our presentation.
That's right. Well, we've got to take a break, so just tell that egg to stay there for a minute, and don't you go anywhere either, and we'll be back right after this break.
Creation versus evolution, you weigh the evidence. The human brain, a marvel of engineering. The brain has over 10 billion nerve cells. It also sends out electrical impulses at almost 300 miles per hour and receives 2,000 responses per second. The brain constantly receives signals from 137,000 light receptors in the eyes, 100,000 hearing receptors from the ears, 3,000 taste buds, 30,000 heat sensors on the skin, 250,000 cold sensors, and 500,000 touch sensors. How can anybody believe this magnificent structure was not designed? Today's guest on Origins, anatomist Dr. David Menton, is a speaker for Answers in Genesis. Audiences enjoy his well-illustrated presentations on a variety of fascinating topics. Many of these lectures are available on DVD. If you're interested in the subject of creation, you'll definitely want these for your own. Orders are being taken at 800-778-3390. You can also write to Answers in Genesis, P.O. Box 510, Hebron, Kentucky, 41048. Or visit the website at www.answersingenesis.org.
We're back with Dr. David Menton, and we're talking about how we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and the process of birth. And Dr. Menton, I've noticed, I think I've counted 3 times already that you've talked about it being miraculous, what's happening inside the uterus, as that if it didn't happen just this way, life would be over. But God has made it so it works.
Let's look at that process.
Great.
You're going to see several more miracles in my view. Yes, we have some scientific explanations, but you can only go just so far with these explanations. First of all, in the vicinity of the egg, and we see the egg here, and we notice the egg is surrounded by this kind of a red shell here. And yes, the human egg does have what we might call a shell. It's not a hard shell like in a chicken. It's like the scum of Jell-O. It's a kind of a rubbery gel. We call it the zona pellucida, which just means the clear layer. And it goes all the way around the egg. And then, as you know, around that would be this accumulation of cells that make a sticky substance that the cilia use to move the egg.
Okay.
There would be probably, if fertilization is going to occur, several sperm in the area, probably a few hundred. Only one must be allowed to fertilize the egg. So one of the first challenges we have is, how do you keep every sperm cell except one from fertilizing? This is a fabulous story right here. Wait till you see it. Here's a sperm that we'll say has gone its way in. The first barrier that it comes up to is the sticky material of that cumulus. There's no way it can get through that cumulus, except a special enzyme is secreted by the head of the sperm that digests a channel through the cumulus.
It literally eats its way through. In
Absolutely.
A sense. Yes.
It takes a specific enzyme to do that. Oh. You are now at the zona pellucida, and there isn't any way you're getting through the zona pellucida, except there is a second special enzyme.
Two different enzymes.
Two completely different ones located in different positions in the sperm head that specifically digest its way through the zona pellucida. It's not over yet. You've just reached, actually we should come in over here because there's a gap there. You've reached the cell membrane.
Okay.
And there's no way that that cell membrane is going to allow this foreign sperm cell, which is from a whole different person, different genetics, different membrane. How do the two ever get together and the egg allow the sperm in? We really don't know the answer to that, except we know that as soon as the sperm head touches that egg membrane, there's some kind of a chemical recognition that goes on that identifies that, yes, this is a sperm. It's of the same species. And if it is, that sperm's membrane fuses with the egg membrane, and the sperm enters the interior of the egg. Now, what about all the other sperm in the vicinity? They might have gone through the cumulus and through the zona pellucida to different degrees. But the first sperm head to touch the membrane of the egg initiates an incredible response from the egg called the cortical reaction, in which little granules break and secrete an enzyme called ovoperoxidase that goes out here to the zona pellucida all the way around the egg and instantly hardens the zona pellucida, stopping all the other sperm cells in their tracks.
So it kind of counteracts the enzyme that would break it down. It makes it so it doesn't break
That's
down.
right. It hardens the whole zona pellucida. And what this means is that polyspermy, that is more than one sperm fertilizing,
Right.
is very rare.
Yeah.
When polyspermy occurs, the whole system spontaneously breaks down. In other words, you cannot go on with polyspermy. It's the end of that particular event. So even that's terribly important. Now, there's a series of, what, 3 or 4 miracles right there just to get the egg fertilized.
Amazing.
But you haven't seen anything yet. We now have, and don't ask me which is which here, Don, I really don't know. This is inside of a human egg, and one of these two groups of chromosomes is from the male, and one is from the female that's been in the egg all along. We still don't have fertilization yet. The sperm's in here, but it isn't fertilized. But when these two groups of chromosomes fuse together, combining the DNA of a mother and a father, that's the beginning of a new human being. Well, here's the first cell division. At about 30 hours after the ovulation, that fertilized cell will divide to make the first 2 cells of the baby's body. Notice we still have the zona pellucida running out here. Do you see it around the edge? Sometimes the zona pellucida is defective or breaks down. And if it does, these 2 cells, number 1 and number 2 of the first 2 cells, can break apart, separate. Oh, this is a heady thought now, Don. I don't want you to think about this too long. But if they separate, you get 2 babies. And if they stay together, you get 1 baby.
I got it. Twins.
Well, a special kind of twin. You see, most twins are two different eggs fertilized by two different sperm. It was a multiple ovulation.
Right.
But these would be identical twins. They're virtually a clone. But they're God's clone, and only God's clones really work properly. The clones that we make, like Dolly the sheep, are very short-lived. So it's a heady thought to think that each of us could have been two people.
Wow.
But because those cells didn't separate, we're
Stay
one.
together, yeah.
And I just leave that up to God, because I can't figure that one out. I just say, Lord, you know, I don't know. From 2 cells, it divides, we get 4. They divide, we get 8. And this little ball of cells, called a zygote, will finally enter the uterus. When it enters the uterus, a hollow chamber will develop inside. We call this a blastocyst. The amazing thing is, do you see the cells in blue here?
I do.
They are the baby. It's the only part of this group of cells that is the baby proper. You might wonder, what are all these red cells going around out here? That's really a fascinating story. Those cells will make the placenta.
Yeah.
Because you see, this baby is going to wait while the placenta develops. And these cells that make the placenta actually burrow through the wall of the uterus, something that really should never happen. But it does. Burrow through the wall of the uterus, penetrate inside, and only when the placenta develops to a certain point to support the developing baby will these cells that actually make the baby continue on to develop and
So the progress of the baby itself actually stops until the placenta has both rooted in the wall and has developed sufficiently to support it.
That's right.
Yeah.
It has to begin to develop. And these cells, as they penetrate, actually fuse together, forming a huge cell. We call it a syncytial cell. And this will penetrate. This is the way that actually looks in the flesh. This is the inner cell mass right here. That is the baby in a human. And these cells out here are called the cytotrophoblast. And they will make that most wonderful of all organs in the body, the placenta.
Wow. And one of the last things that you said was how important and how, I think you even used the word marvelous, the human placenta is. Can you tell us what it is and why it's so special?
Well, you know, I think the placenta is the most underrated organ in the body. It does such a marvelous job for us, and when the baby's born, everybody's so excited about the baby, we just throw the placenta away. It's very friable, it breaks down very quickly, it has almost no lifespan to it at all. And yet that amazing organ has supported that baby in a way that few people recognize. You know, it's one of the most, if not the most important organ in our body. We wouldn't be here without it. And yet none of us had our own placenta in our own body.
No, that's right.
The placenta, when you think about it, is rather like this plug here.
Okay.
You know, this could be hooked up to a computer or one of our TV cameras here, and those computers or cameras would not work if they weren't plugged in. And you think when you plug them in, there's just a couple of holes in a wall. It can't amount to much, but there's an entire power plant. And that's what the placenta really is. It's like the entire power plant. It does so many things. And we'll see some of the things that it does as we look into the marvelous development of the placenta. Let me head up to our board here.
I'm anxious to see what you have for us today.
Well, in diagrammatic form here, we have a structure called the blastocyst. The blastocyst is a structure that actually implants into the wall of the uterus. It does so at about 5-6 days after ovulation, and the baby just kind of waits for a while. Right in here, this part will be developing into the baby.
Okay.
But it has to wait until the plug-in and the power plant get set up. This is the wall of the uterus that you see over here on the right. And it has developed glands that make a sort of a fertile soil, if you will, into which this seed will implant. And there are many, many blood vessels in here. We see one right here. And these are blood vessels that are in the wall of the mother's uterus. Right away, we have a miracle on our hands. This tissue we're looking at here in green and what have you is a completely different individual, genetically distinct from the mother.
Right.
The mother's over here. This is the uterus. You've heard people say that the developing baby is part of the mother's body. Well, this just simply is not true, except in a trivial sense. This tissue, were you to inject it in the skin of the mother, would build an inflammatory response. In other words, the body would recognize it as foreign tissue and reject it. But one of the first miracles we encounter is as this blastocyst penetrates through the uterine wall, it is not rejected. In fact, it shouldn't even be able to burrow through the wall. Our body doesn't normally allow foreign tissue to just burrow right in.
Right.
But it does. And the cells that do the burrowing here are really pretty remarkable. These cells are called cytotrophoblasts, and they fuse together to form what we call a giant cell. So if two cells fuse, you now have a little bigger cell with 2 nuclei. If another one fuses, you have 3 nuclei, another one 4, and so on until you get a really big cell. And this cell is called a syncytial cell, and the name changes from cytotrophoblast to syncytial trophoblast. And it is these syncytial trophoblast cells that will establish a relationship with the mother's blood supply so that the nutrients and gases in the mother's blood supply can be made available to the baby. By the way, it's also these cells of the syncytial trophoblast here that secrete a particular protein that circulates in the blood called human chorionic gonadotropin, and this is what these tests for whether the mother is pregnant or not are looking for.
Okay.
HCG. And that means that 6-7 days, right around in there, is about as early as you'd be able to pick up that the mother is in fact pregnant. Well, let's follow this sequence as this marvelous structure penetrates in. Here it's penetrated a little further. Note that many cells have fused out in this area here. We're getting really close to the blood vessel. Baby is pretty much still just biding its time over here. And notice it's penetrated quite deeply into the uterus. Eventually, it'll go right below the whole surface as it penetrates deeper. There it is, dropped below the surface of the uterus. You couldn't even see it from the inside of the uterus now. It's below.
It's actually burrowed its way in until it's totally buried in the uterus.
Absolutely. And now notice here's a blood vessel of the mother getting very close to the syncytial trophoblast mass here. A new feature that appears at this time is there are sort of empty chambers here inside this syncytial trophoblast. And these will become larger and eventually will be invaded with mother's blood. Let's take this the next step. Now we see that the syncytial trophoblast has done something really extraordinary and risky. It has literally eroded the ends of the arteries in the uterus of the mother. Eventually, 20 rather large arteries, nearly the size of lead pencils, will be having their ends literally truncated, and the blood of these arteries will shoot up into these spaces that you see here in the syncytial trophoblast. Now, you need to do this without leakage, naturally. Not only that, but this blood ought to clot.
Right.
Because it's encountering something that's not a blood vessel. It's encountering foreign tissue. We should have one massive clot. It'd be the end of life right there. It doesn't clot. The clotting mechanism is actually suppressed in the placenta.
It's amazing.
So mother's blood doesn't clot there. Notice baby is pretty much still biding its time here. Only when we have a good hookup and we get bathing of mother's blood can we really get seriously involved with the development of the baby. Well, we've jumped ahead here now to a 14-day embryo. This is still very early. We've reduced the magnification. The baby is beginning to develop here. We won't discuss what's going on there exactly, but the important thing is that we have mother's blood coming into this syncytial trophoblast, and at these points here, where you see red, baby's blood will come in inside of blood vessels and get very close to mother's blood, being separated by this single huge cell mass called a syncytial trophoblast. Let's just see what that would look like. I'm going to draw. I'm not a great drawer, but we will try this. The baby is up here. The placenta will draw a line right across here, so blood vessels of the baby will come down to that. And down here is the uterus of the mother. The placenta will form 20 structures on average that sort of look like a tree. This is a tree upside down, and here the branches go right down into the uterine wall, and it goes out here. And that is one of 20 such trees that develop. These are the branches. Now the branches themselves will branch, and then the branches will branch, and so this will become almost like fuzz out here. The baby's blood vessels will run from the baby down into this structure, out, make a little capillary loop. I should have used a different color perhaps. Make a little capillary loop here and come back, and we'll have many such blood vessels. Mother's blood, on the other hand, will be out here. So the transfer will be between baby's blood and mother's blood across this surface, which is that single cell mass we call a syncytial trophoblast. With that in mind, let's just look at what this would be like. At 40 days, the placenta goes all the way around the baby. The baby is quite well developed at this point. We can see it in here. The amniotic fluid is out in here. And these little trees that we discussed before are various masses like this
that outer part
and
there.
this.
Okay.
And we're just seeing all the branches. By looking at a tree or a bush with just many, many branches. Baby's blood would be running inside of all these little fuzzy branches. Mother's blood would be bathing.
It's all the black.
All this black area is mother's blood out here. So it can kind of filter down here among all the branches, right? All the way around. Now this is what we're going to do. We'll magnify that. This is one of the tiniest branches of the tree. Okay.
All right.
You get down these little finger-like processes. You need a microscope. In fact, this is an electron microscope to see this. And we notice that even the tiniest branches have little bumps on them too. We call those microvilli. The surface area is immense. In fact, if we were to unfold every little thing, all the branches, make it all flat, we'd probably be maybe half the size of a tennis court.
Wow.
With mother's blood on one side, baby's blood on the other. Now I've got something that's going to blow your socks off. In fact, if you don't have socks, you could lose a toenail on this one.
All right.
That entire surface is one cell.
That's all those fuzzy spots.
Everything. All that fuzz, if you
trees,
straighten it out, it would be huge.
it's
like
one
a
cell.
massive rug carpet.
amazing.
Is one cell. Now, millions and millions of nuclei in there.
Okay.
But one seamless cell. And all of the nutrients between mother and baby, all of the gases, everything, must go across this seamless cell. And they do so either passively by sort of soaking across, or they do so actively by having special pumps that pump them across. Let's just make an incision through this placental villus here. We're going to cut right there and see what it looks like on the inside. Out here is mother's blood. See, these are red blood cells out here. They belong to mom. All of these out here are mother's blood. But you see the red blood cells in here?
Yes, sir.
They're baby's blood.
Yeah.
And that's how close they get. Notice mother's blood here, baby's blood here, and in between the two is this little barrier here, and that's the seamless syncytial trophoblast that lines the entire surface of the placenta. Now, water can go across this passively. Sadly, alcohol can go across this passively. Yeah. That's why women who drink alcohol in large quantities when they're pregnant can actually have a baby born with fetal alcohol syndrome, because that alcohol goes right through into the baby, just like the baby we're drinking it. Also, recreational drugs. Many of them can pass right across this barrier passively. Can get into the blood and you get a crack baby, for example, on somebody with crack cocaine. Other things do not go across passively. I mean, the oxygen from the mother's blood goes to the baby's blood. Okay. And the baby has a special hemoglobin with a high affinity for oxygen. higher than the mother's blood does. There have been cases where the mother has died of asphyxiation, but the baby in the womb survived because it could use the limited oxygen more efficiently than mom. So this is just one of these little placental villus, of which there's just millions.
Now those can be two totally different blood types.
Yes. And so that's all separated out too, because there's no mixing of the blood.
It's not a mixing, it's a passing of nutrients and gases and things that are needed for life, but never the mixing.
Now, for example, a
That's
baby
amazing.
needs iron to make this blood, right?
Right.
That iron comes from the mother's blood, just about like everything else does. To get the iron from the mother's blood to the baby's blood requires a special carrier protein, very, very complicated, that carries it across from one side to the other. And there are many, many other carrier proteins like this that are involved in getting nutrients from the mother's to the baby's blood.
So the blood supply stays totally separate, but the nutrients and the needed materials pass over.
That's right, back
That's
and
amazing.
forth.
Absolutely.
And you know, that placenta is doing everything. It's a kidney, it's a liver, it's an intestinal system, it's an endocrine system, it's all sorts of things to the mother, or to the baby. In fact, a baby can be born without kidneys, without a liver, without an intestinal tract, without a lung. In fact, most of these structures aren't functional anyway until the baby's born. The placenta does it all.
So that one organ, the placenta, basically does everything that all of our organs do collectively once we're born.
All the ones I mentioned, right.
No wonder you're excited about the placenta.
It's super organ. Now, I haven't told you the most incredible thing yet. This is almost beyond belief. When the baby's born, shortly thereafter, the placenta is ejected. And when the placenta is ejected, 20 major arteries going into this placenta are severed. Do you see a problem here?
Yeah, the mother could bleed to death.
Yeah, let's add to that problem. Remember what I said? The blood clotting mechanism is suppressed in the mother's uterus at this time. So we have basically 20 severed arteries in a hemophiliac. This pretty much ought to be the end of life right here.
For the mother. Yeah.
Yes. And of course, no more babies after this, because you couldn't have babies if you didn't have a solution. The solution obviously isn't clotting. It wouldn't work fast enough anyway. Each one of these places where the artery is severed when the placenta pulls away, there's a little muscular sphincter like a purse string that has a good sense to be on the mother's side, not on the baby's side, and it squeezes suddenly, clamping off all 20 arteries so that the net loss of blood is maybe a cupful in a normal delivery.
So a mother develops these little, help me here, muscles?
They are in the wall of the arteries of the mother, in the uterus, and they stay open, thank the Lord, until the uterus unplugs. It's been said that's the largest wound any human being ever gets and lives to tell the story, and that's the removal of the placenta from the uterine wall. And they all just clamp down, and if this were not so, the end of life.
Dr. Menton, you never cease to amaze me. We've got to take a break right now. Don't you go anywhere. We'll be back in just a minute to finish this incredible story of a journey we've all taken, the journey of birth, and how God has made us so marvelously. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Creation versus evolution. You weigh the evidence. Eve, the mother of all, her DNA is remarkable. Over recent years, scientists have conducted a lot of research on DNA that's found in the mitochondria of a cell. Now, this DNA is only inherited through females. By comparing mutation or mistakes in the DNA of people worldwide, scientists came to a startling conclusion. It looks as if all people living today are descended from one woman. With the latest mutation data, the ancestral mother of all lived a mere 6,000 years ago. Today's guest on Origins, anatomist Dr. David Menton, is a speaker for Answers in Genesis. Audiences enjoy his well-illustrated presentations on a variety of fascinating topics. Many of these lectures are available on DVD. If you are interested in the subject of creation, you'll definitely want these for your own. Orders are being taken at 800-778-3390. You can also write to Answers in Genesis, P.O. Box 510, Hebron, Kentucky, 41048, or visit the website at www.answersingenesis.org.
We're back with Dr. David Menton, and we've been looking at how fearfully and wonderfully made we are. And Dr. Menton, when we left, you had just told us that the placenta was the super organ, and I think you convinced all of us that it was. What an incredible job it does while the baby is forming. But we've kind of gotten off of the placenta. Let's get back to the baby.
Well, here's a baby that is at the 7th week. Here's a 7-week fetus. You can see still attached to the vessels that go to the placenta. We can see the little fingers and toes and the eyes and the ear.
Love it.
And this is only the 7th week.
Right.
Well, I'm going to jump all the way to the end here. Here's a baby in position for childbirth at full term, 9 months. Head down, ready to go. You can see the cord going to the placenta there. And Don, we run into another problem right here, and we're going to need another miracle. Have you heard about the fellow that built the boat in his basement and never checked the doorway?
Yeah.
Spent all that time and couldn't get the boat out. Well, this is a problem we have here. You see, there isn't any way on earth you're getting this baby out of there.
We got more baby than we got hold to get him out, don't we?
And it's not just because you can't stretch the tissues enough. The bones are too small.
Wow.
Let me show you what the problem is here. This is the pelvic bones, the hip bones. Go right across here. And the baby's head has to go right through here. And the simple fact is, the baby's head is not going to fit through there. That's it. That's pretty much the end of the story. Be the end of the human race. You'll never get a second chance to get this right if you're thinking about evolution. What happens is so extraordinary. There's a joint right here between the pubic bones, and there's a joint right here between the sacrum and the iliac, and another similar joint over here. Those 3 joints, this one, and this one, which are firmly held together with just a little bit of flexibility. Special enzyme collagenase is produced that dissolves not entirely, just partially, these ligaments, which allow the bones to flex and open just enough to let the baby's head through. And even then, the baby's head must turn like a key in a lock, just correctly, to fit through. And when the baby gets through, its problems are not over. It seems that while the baby was developing, it really didn't need much blood to go to the lungs because the lungs can't breathe anyway.
Right.
And so most of the blood, instead of going to the lungs, takes a little bypass right over into the aorta and down. You better come up with a solution for that just as soon as the baby's born. Once again, a little muscular sphincter closes off the bypass and for the first time sends the blood to the lungs. Same problem down here. The bloodstream has been largely bypassing the liver. Why? Because the placenta is a good liver with the help of the mother. But as soon as a baby's born, you must instantaneously at some point divert the blood from the bypass to go through the liver for the first time in quantity. And all of this happens through a rather amazing change in the blood circulation, so that we have circulation in the lungs, circulation in the liver, and it all happens almost instantaneously. And without it, everything we've been talking about up until now would have been pretty much a waste of time.
And we don't do any of that. God just does it.
Absolutely.
That's
It's
amazing.
just God's work, and what can we say? It's God's doing.
You know, I haven't had a chance to count how many times you use the word miracle in this lesson, but it truly is a cumulative miracle. It's a series of miracles from the very beginning. And thank you so much for the gift you've given us in this explanation. Friends, I hope that you have enjoyed as much as I have this awesome look into the work of God within a mother's womb to make each one of us. This is a miracle we've all experienced before we ever set feet in this world. And so I just pray that as you've watched the work of God in the making of the body, that it's touched your soul with a sense of awe for the greatness and the work of our God. I'd love to hear from you and see what you think of this marvelous material that Dr. Menton has shared with us. Will you write to me at Origins, Cornerstone Television, Wall, PA, 15148, or get a hold of us on the internet at originstv.org. You know, more than ever, as we wrap this show up today, I just want to remind you that it's God's view that He created you, and that should be your worldview too. God bless you until we see you next time.